Welcome to a special episode, special fall episode of Back to the City. I've got Guante in the studio with me. Welcome, Guante.
Hello.
And we're here to discuss your new record with Big Cats, the first in quite some time. I am very, very excited for your record release show, also featuring Lydia Liza at the Hook and Ladder on Saturday, November 30th. What you'll be releasing is All Dressed Up, No Funeral, and we're going to take a deep dive into that record together today. That is a lyric from the opening track, Whatever You Do, Don't Put the Words Climate Crisis in the title. And the lyric goes, All Dressed Up, No Funeral, Such a Beautiful Time to Be Alive, which I think is such a potent and interesting starting point. Could you reflect on that lyric, All Dressed Up, No Funeral, Such a Beautiful Time to Be Alive?
And if it's okay to back up a second and just, thank you for having me here, but I also want to thank you just for the work that you're doing, and like as a kind of signal booster and someone who's really like providing a service that doesn't exist in a lot of other ways, not just in a general sense, but I think historically, like right now in this moment, there just aren't a lot of opportunities to like you said, dive into the lyrics and talk about them and really have a deeper engagement with the creative work that isn't just a soundbite or a social media post. And that means a lot. And I know I'm speaking for myself, but I think for a lot of the other artists who come here too. So thank you for that.
Thank you, my pleasure as well.
As for that particular line in that particular song, which kicks off that particular album, it's a concept album about the climate crisis that I started writing in kind of later 2022, early 2023, knowing that it was an important thing to write about. But for people who do creative work, like it is for some of us a more difficult thing to write about, because it can feel, if we're not living in a low-lying area or in an island community, like it can feel more abstract. Like, oh yeah, the winters are more warm, like that's kind of weird. Or like the sky is pink because of wildfires, that's kind of weird. But there is maybe a little bit of distance. And so I wanted to challenge myself, living in Minnesota. How do you like engage with that really, really important issue, one of the most singularly important issues of this moment and in human history? And the things that we do as creative writers, I'm making my way back to the specific question. But the thing that we do as creative writers is, try to take something abstract and make it concrete. So you zoom in on it. Don't talk about, specific metrics of temperature change over the course of years. Talk about a story, tell a story, paint a picture, use an image. Like that's the general approach, I think. But again, even that, as someone who is in Minnesota, who is maybe one step removed from some of the most immediate effects, although we're all impacted by it, but a step removed from the most immediate effects, that wasn't necessarily going to be the approach. And so I sat with it, I struggled with it, I talked to my friends who are writers, and tried to kind of wrap my head around this. Like, why is this important for me to write about? And what do I have to contribute that is like actually meaningful? Because it's never going to be an album about like carbon offsets and like the specific line items in the Green New Deal or whatever. And what kind of cracked the code for me, just through that process of working was, on some level, it isn't an album about the climate crisis. It's an album about despair. And about what we do when we feel despair. How do we navigate it? How do we work through it? And so there's a lot in the album about grief and like kind of embracing grief as a positive thing that can help us navigate despair. There's a lot on the album about collective action. The idea that there is no one action that I can take to solve this big problem. It's all about how do we work together, how do we join in organizations, how do we organize on this larger level. And so that then became something that I feel like I do have something to offer, because so much of my career and my writing through the last 15, 20 years has been...
Guante and your poetry, and all of your writing,
has been about kind of pushing back against despair, like finding hope in collective resistance and collective action, and pointing people towards organizing and activism and all that. And so like that then unlocked all these possibilities. And so the line in the song, All Dressed Up, No Funeral, Such a Beautiful Time to Be Alive, I think it's really important to acknowledge the despair. Don't just like push it away and say like, oh, it's nothing, just like keep working. But like to acknowledge that these are dark times. It's okay to have a kind of like gallows humor about it, a little bit of like cynicism even, but then to always be able to show the other side of the coin, which is then, this is a time of endless possibility, and it's scary, and like, you know, I'm rambling a little bit, but just really, really briefly, like writing the album in 2023, then, you know, October 7th happening, and then the Israeli response to that, and like the U.S. support of the genocide in Palestine, like for the next year, and then just recently Trump winning the election, like crisis after crisis after crisis. And while the album was written about one thing, it became about all these other things. And again, going back to the idea of like, this is a scary, scary time. People are going to be hurt and are hurting right now. And, not but it is a time of incredible possibility.
When I was connecting with some English friends on Zoom just after the election, they were highlighting that climate seemed to barely be a focus this time around. In the election in a very, very disconcerting way, and your lyric, all they got to do is not hit the thing they just hit, kind of lands differently now.
Yeah, the album begins with a kind of like Titanic reference of like, oh, you know, all you have to do is not hit the iceberg that you just hit, and like just that as a metaphor for climate policy, and not on a policy up here level, but on a deeper, like, it feels like it's already too late sometimes. It feels like we all know what to do and we're not doing it, and like that's incredibly frustrating. And so then acknowledge the frustration, and then the rest of the album is how do we work through the frustration, how do we navigate it to get to a place ideally of action.
Yeah, the Titanic metaphor at the beginning works so well to ground the experience in despair, and specifically the idea of the musicians continuing to play for the benefit of the rich people getting onto their lifeboats. Some of them, these musicians, as you highlight, were just going down with the ship and providing, continuing to provide art in that moment. It's such a potent image at the beginning. Could you expand a little bit more on that Titanic?
Yeah, I assume that was a like apocryphal story, but I think it's real. The little bit of research that I did, a real story. And I think, again, aside from the specific function in that specific moment of what they were doing, I think it also works as a metaphor for the idea that art and expression is not just about my personal expression or like speaking truth to power. Like, art can also have a very like concrete material impact on what is happening around us. And I think about, you know, again, as a metaphor, the idea of art that raises money for specific causes, or art that brings people into work that they wouldn't be otherwise. And you know, so again, so much of my own career has been about exploring those areas in which, like I do think the expression side of it and the kind of like the deeper spiritual connection side of art is important, but I'm also really, really interested in those much more down-to-earth functions of an arts practice, and like the spaces that artists inhabit within a community as networkers and as bridge builders.
The ship is going down, and you're a poet, you're a prophet, an extraordinary person, so why aren't you making this? That's such a fitting opening. You talked about despair, and my favorite title of a song on the record is "Look on My Despair, Ye Mighty and Work," which, as you highlight, is a remix of the line "Look on my works, ye mighty and despair" from Shelley's Ozymandias. Could you expand a bit on what you're doing with that remix of that phrase, especially given the centrality of despair to the project for you?
Yeah, I mean, on a very like simple level, like it was just funny to me, like just changing the words around. There's like a cleverness to it, which again, like, is not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just like, it was fun to think about that. But then also, the piece is central on the album. I think it's like the middle track on the album, more or less. And on a form level, the writing challenge I gave to myself was like, write a traditionally structured, you know, rapping verse, like in couplets, but none of it's gonna rhyme. Like you have the same rhythm, but every time the ear anticipates a rhyme, you switch to something else. And it does that through the first like 20 bars of the song. And then like, again, eventually comes together, and this idea that the thing that we're fighting for might feel like it's never going to come, but we have to keep moving and keep going and keep going, because we don't know, like we have to have the humility to know that the actions we are taking in this moment can and probably will have an impact, even if we don't live to see it, even if it's something we don't anticipate. That's, again, the way that form can hopefully like support content in that way. But then the substance of the piece itself just being about, like we've been talking about, acknowledging the hopelessness that can be very easy to feel. Not saying that it's a bad thing or that you shouldn't feel what you feel, but I think one of the lines is our feelings are real, but our feelings are not the only thing that is real.
Yeah.
And that has been so helpful to me because it's very, like, some of the things we're talking about, grief, despair, hopelessness, cynicism, they're kind of reflexive. You feel them, you don't try to feel them, you just feel them. And a lot of, I think, the pop culture and society tells you that those are bad feelings and you shouldn't feel them. And again, I think the question is always like, what do we do with them? How do we, particularly in community with each other, navigate them?
Yeah, absolutely. What you were just saying made me think of Sisyphus and the Sisyphean struggle of, okay, keep going, don't lose, stay in alignment. And Roguelike is a song that applies the lens of kind of video game, roguelike, where every time you die, you start over at the very beginning. And I think that's such a powerful metaphor, particularly combined with the lyric. The question was never whether this is the end or not. It's what kind of end will we make it? Which is very, very relatable. It's helpful, I think, isn't it? It's like the kind of Nietzschean idea too, I think, to just, okay, here I am, and now I kind of live and act and participate in a way that I would like to be able to fully own in this moment.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about the development of this song, Roguelike? Because I think you use that video game metaphor very well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking of, like, part of that song came out of just my own reading and study. I'm thinking of a couple quotes. One is, I think it's Angela Davis quoting Gramsci. I'm the Italian. Yeah. I pronounce that Antonio Gramsci. Talking about the pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. Right? That, like, again, we can think in our intellect, in our kind of logical reasoning, like, oh, things are really bad, especially when it comes to climate. Like, we are not doing what we need to be doing. But then an optimism of the will, like, to keep fighting. I also think about the writer and activist Kelly Hayes. Wrote an incredible essay. This was years ago now, but one of the lines that really stuck with me from it was, if this is the end of the world, who do you want to be at the end of the world? Like, that I think captures kind of what you were talking about really well too. And so writing a song about the kind of pop cultural vision of the post-apocalypse or of the apocalypse, which is very like Mad Max, like you survive by any means necessary, and you fight for resources, and you have an underground bunker that you run away from everyone in, and that's how you survive. When historically, people who survive times of crisis and catastrophe are not the toughest. People are the people who are able to work together, and that often involves humility. That often involves being able to cooperate. And so I wanted to write a song that in some way could capture that kind of narrative, counter-narrative. And so using the structure of a roguelike video game, which all this stuff comes together in a way that I think is pretty elegant in the song, but talking about it to you feels like it's all over the place.
No, it's very elegant. The fourth time I faced the end of the world, I sold my soul to the bear god and just tried to hibernate through it. It worked. I made it further than the other runs, but never stopped to wonder further toward what. That's the lyric, or the set of lyrics that I was thinking of when you were talking just now. The idea of, okay, is the point just staying alive, or is the context of the end times inviting more than just going into hibernation and staying alive for longer?
It's definitely the running thread on the album, kind of what you just said.
Hey There Medusa, the previous song, I love that you take Hey There Delilah and
But titles are my favorite thing as a songwriter, like coming up with titles, and like they're extremely clever in my own little head. I don't know if other people get the jokes or appreciate them, but like it's so much fun.
In
It's
a
so
very
much
good
fun.
way.
Yeah.
In a good way. There's tend to your grief like a garden, tend to your grief like a fire. I'm recognizing the centrality of that couplet more so than before.
Yeah.
That's potent too, I think, the idea of tending to grief and these two quite different ways of tending to grief. Do you have any further thoughts on these two different statements, tending to grief like a garden and tending to grief like a fire?
As someone who's like day job as a poet, like it's so much fun to dig into kind of the word nerd elements of that, like tend being a word that relates to these two different things in a really interesting way. Like the word, it's similar but it's also different. Like tending to a garden is about nurturing and care. Like when we talk about tend to your grief like a garden, I think about being gentle with yourself, allowing to feel what you feel, to let your grief kind of grow in the direction that it needs to grow in order to keep on as a person. And then tend to a fire, like tend to your grief like a fire, to me that is about grief as fuel for action. Like to feel really bad either about interpersonal grief, like losing people we care about, or kind of world events grief, but using that as action, like I said, as fuel for action, activism, organizing.
That comes very shortly before the status quo is already monstrous. So when these fascists call you a monster, show them what a monster is, which is, I think, maybe my present favorite part of the record. And that, I feel like, is tending to one's grief like a fire, like harnessing the grief.
That also, I keep referencing the person whose name I don't know how to pronounce, but I think that's also a Gramsci quote. The whole song is built around the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And so it's a song that takes the kind of image or metaphor of the monster and tries to kind of flip it on its head a little bit. In terms of like when the powers that be classify certain people as monsters, whether we're talking about immigrants or trans people or poor people or like, you know, any group that is scapegoated in that way, like potentially claiming that and being like, well, you know, what power does the monster in literature and in reality actually have to fight back? And I ended up, I don't know if it says in the notes, but like that was the inspiration for the song, but then I ended up leaning away from it because of what he was talking about versus what I was talking about. It because of the flipping on its head, I didn't want there to be any uncertainty of what I was actually talking about there, but I think it works out really well to have that seed of inspiration grow into a song that becomes its own thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of referencing not just say Greek mythology, but also pop music like REM. I really like in the song, it's the end of the world, it's the end of their world as they know it, and I feel nothing. A, I really love Lydia Liza's delivery of that. And B, it is funny and clever again spin on that phrase from the REM song, which is obviously fitting because it's to do with the end of the world, but the end of whose world? And I feel nothing. They don't feel fine. Again, it's clever and immediate, but I wonder if you could, like through the lens of that title again, expand a bit on what you're doing with that song.
Well, one, just before I forget, like that was a fun song to write and record, because when you know the REM song, it's impossible not to hear the melody. And I wanted to make sure that our melody was not, it's not a sample, it's not an interpolation, it's I guess a lyrical interpolation, but it's a different melody. But it was really hard to like sit and like sing the scratch vocals to make sure that it didn't follow the exact melody. But I think like you said, I think Lydia like knocked it out of the park.
Absolutely.
And I'm so happy with how that turned out. But then the actual like the substance of that line and then of the bigger song is again the idea that apocalypses or the end of world catastrophes, crises, are pivot points. This is a cliche, but like they can be endings, but they can also be beginnings, right? And I think reframing the end of the world, not in the Mad Max pop culture like zombie apocalypse sense, but thinking about the end of the world as an opportunity to build something that actually is life affirming and serves all of us, and can actually be something really powerful and beautiful. Like that specific song is specifically about like policing and abolition, and thinking about the end of not the world, but the end of the kind of the order of how things have been done.
Yeah.
And being able to look towards something else.
Yeah, I love how it references a lot of One Bad Cop from your record post race.
It's from 2016, I think.
Yeah, and then immediately after, kind of interpolating your own song there, consider at the time that felt radical, then 5 years later, abolition's Instagrammable. So picture 5 years from now, how about another 5? You were talking about the work of the artist needing to be like concrete, and there's something especially interesting there. Like, how did you find yourself referencing that song of yours?
I mean, I think there's a deep writer thing I can say, and then there's a really shallow thing I can say. And I'm shallow not in a bad way, but the surface level thing is, as an independent artist, you create work and you're proud of it, and no one listens to it, right? And like I should be very, very grateful for what success I have had in terms of having an audience, being able to be an artist full time. Like, I don't want to take that for granted, but it's also, being a bestseller on Bandcamp means you sold 100 records, right? It's not a ton of people, and so I often have tried to find ways to reference older work and bring it back, just because it means a lot to me on a personal level. And like that specific song, written again, like before the 2020 uprisings, before everything that happened post 2020, being about abolition, and about abolition in the sense of like, not just let's get rid of all the cops, but like let's get rid of all the cops and think about what it means to actually create safe communities, like what resources need to be shifted to create safe and healthy communities. That is something that has not gone away as a relevant issue, and so it seemed like the perfect opportunity to, one, bring that little piece back in the song as a way to just again like affirm the importance of that, but then two, to think about, like what you were saying, kind of the role of the artist in movement work. It's very easy to say this in a way that is kind of word salady, but I mean it very genuinely, to imagine the world that we're working toward, to tell the story of the world that we want to live in, because telling that story and having that vision and imagination is a first step. It's not the only step we need to take, but it is a first step toward actually getting there.
It's such a great case in point of that. We were talking about that kind of thing earlier, and then we witnessed this case in point within that song. Looking through the eye of the needle, we're seeing camels, I think is such an intriguing line, and you highlight in the notes that the camel lyric is referencing Luke 18:25. Like, it's harder for to do with rich people getting to heaven through the eye of the needle.
Like it's easier to move through the eye of the needle than it is for a rich person to get to heaven.
Yeah. Is there more that you'd like to say about your use of? You say I'm not religious, but it's a good line, which is true. I think it relates to the end of their world as they know it, and I feel nothing. If so, how so? What's going on with that lyric? Camel.
So I think, again, not a religious person, but like I think the line is, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for the rich man to find heaven, or something like that,
something
right? And so the line, I think also serves a narrative function. There's a song on our previous album, which was 5-6 years ago now, but called "You Say Millionaire Like It's a Good Thing," and the kind of narrative impulse of that song was to frame wealth as bad. Like, so much of this country is about wealth as a good thing, something that we all need to work for, and it's a positive goal.
Taken as a given that that's what everyone is aiming for.
And so I think it's worth just the reframe, and not to say that if you are comfortable you're a bad person specifically, but that the kind of drive toward massive wealth and the endless consumption and endless like growth mindset it can be and often very much is a like moral failure. And so like that's what that song was about on that album. And then that line I think was just a small kind of reference to that counter narrative. Like if the dominant narrative is like wealth, the counter narrative is it's actually a bad thing to want to hoard that much wealth, which also goes back to the roguelike song.
Yeah, exactly.
Hoarding resources versus sharing resources. We think, again, pop culturally dominant narrative, the people who survive are the ones who hoard the most resources, but again, in reality, historically, people who survive are the ones who are able to share.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a connection between those two songs and the final track, which is the oldest track as well, Never Tell Me the Odds. The odds refers to what are the odds of your existence. And I'm just going to quote the central lines here, right near the very end of the record. Some see the elegant complexity of bodies or the natural beauty of the planet and they say it's godly. There's got to be divine intelligence behind it all because the odds that you would make it on your own are so small. But me, I see millennia trying to murder you. I see 1,000 generations of pain and fear and struggle inscribed into your skeleton, and I see you still here. I think this song and those words really fit very well on this record, despite the fact that they are so much older than all of the other songs. Could you expand a bit on the centrality of that idea?
Yeah. So I think a running thread or theme on the album is the concept of agency. And I think those specific lines point to, it's easy to see, the like kind of everything happens for a reason explanation for why things are happening or why things do happen historically and personally and in every sense of life. And I wanted to, again, if that's the dominant narrative, I wanted to present a counter narrative. The idea that things happen because they're destined to happen versus things happen because we make them happen. And it seems very, very simple, but I think part of the kind of dominant narrative, counter narrative framing is how deeply embedded these things are in culture, in the way that we think. And I say we in a very, very big, broad sense. Like, think about the world and how important it is to be explicit when we are presenting counter narratives to that. To relate that line then to like the climate crisis theme, the kind of everything happens for a reason, I think is disempowering. That like, things are bad. It's too bad that they're bad, but we're gonna do what we can to survive. Versus, things are bad and we're gonna do what we can to actually fix them, to make them better, to not just survive, but to help each other survive. And it's a subtle shift, but I think it's a really important shift. A lot of the work that I do with young people is about acknowledging all the terrible things that they're going through, while also pointing to resources, pointing to specific historical examples of people pushing back, finding ways to engage that concept of agency.
Totally. Surviving against the odds has been the default mode of so many. And then acknowledging not only the grief, but also that surviving against the odds has always already been the default mode, and then kind of perhaps forming a group identity around that and doing more than just surviving against the odds, but coming together. That's all really powerful. There are two songs that we haven't referred to yet. Purposefully kept them both for the end because they are in conversation with one another, I think. So one of them is the penultimate song, which closes with the voice of B. Ferguson. And what we hear is the climate crisis was caused by long-standing societal crises and injustices like racism, white supremacy, misogyny, queer and transphobia, local and global wealth inequality, etc. So therefore, you cannot face the climate crisis without facing what made it. Those things. And then in Nuclear Whales, you're highlighting that the climate deniers are the transphobes, and the transphobes are the white supremacists, and they can all eat shit. let's use those two moments in those songs as a springboard to reflect on how, for you, the we can't face the climate crisis without facing these other things.
Yeah, I think it's another, not to go back to this well over and over, but a dominant narrative, counter-narrative thing is the dominant narrative of environmentalism is that it's I love trees and I don't eat meat and I ride my bike everywhere and I recycle. And like those are good things, like we should, those are good things to do. But I think being more in tune and connected to like an environmental justice movement, which is more about, here in Minneapolis, like where the incinerator, like what neighborhood is the trash incinerator in, and like getting that shut down, an incredible thing that happened, and like the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute, the Roof Depot project that has happened. Like there's all these like very deep and specific and down to earth connections about how environmentalism and climate justice are deeply, deeply connected to things like urban planning and how kind of white supremacy has impacted urban planning through the years. And the sample of B. Ferguson, who's this incredible poet and writer who has their own career, but the sample is from them giving a lecture on the poetics of the climate crisis. And like that specific quote about how we cannot face the climate crisis until we face colonialism and white supremacy and transmisogyny and all that kind of stuff. I actually found after most of the album was done, and it just kind of like it aligned so beautifully, and it captured so much of what the project of this album is, that wanted to include that specific little piece there. But I think again, on a broader level, on a level of agency and activism, like we don't all have to do everything. I know a ton of people who do not think of themselves as environmental justice organizers or climate people, but they are doing other work in other places. And I think the idea that these things are connected, and again, that's something we can say as kind of a word salad abstract idea, but the examples that I shared a second ago I think show that there are real connections between not just the problems of the climate crisis and all these other things, but also the solutions that people working on issues related to policing and punishment that matters to climate, and people working on issues of media and media justice, and I could laundry list all of the different issues that people work on, but not to be too on the nose, but seeing with the last election and how that happened, just how deeply connected all of these different issues are, and that we need a movement that can push on every boulder at to go back to Sisyphus, that can push on all the boulders at the same time to actually get up the hill. That's probably not the metaphor that I want to be using because Sisyphus never makes it up the hill. But you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's meaningful still. I like the twist on Thoughts and Prayers too. Thoughts and Prayers, that's rich, coming from the rich who don't really have either. That's an important switch, I think, because it's easy to be like, oh, we need more than thoughts and prayers, but it's rich to speak of thoughts and prayers when one is not, when there's an absence of critical thinking and of true like reverence, and it makes me think of a poem, it's a prayer, and your references to incantation. So there is something potent about poems and prayers, and it's rich it's rich to speak of thoughts and prayers when there isn't potency.
Yeah, I mean that phrase, even though it only comes up explicitly, I think in that moment, the idea of thoughts and prayers is really a running thread throughout the whole album, because I think it's easy to hear the thoughts and prayers of people that I dislike, like a opposition politician or a rich person, giving thoughts and prayers to a tragedy. But I think we critique that because it's a way to look like you're doing something when you are not doing anything, to look like you care when your policy choices show that you do not care. So it's easy to critique that. But I think the same thing happens, I don't want to just say on the left, because that's such an abstract thing, but like in my community, with like people that I want to be in community with, in that it's not thoughts and prayers, but I think it's this kind of deep cynicism that happens sometimes, and how a lot of the communication and expression around cynicism end up being really similar to thoughts and prayers. It's like, I'm going to show that I care about this thing, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And not to quote myself, but I think my favorite moment on the whole album, the one that is like maybe the thesis statement of the album, is on the first song. I don't know if you were already going there, but the line, "Cynicism's so easy for cool kids in designer life jackets, but I got friends in real life with every reason to sink who've made lifeboats of their own caskets." And the idea that, cynicism is easy and sometimes fashionable, and the work that we have to do will require us to have hope and require us to be kind of cringy sometimes and build bridges with people who are not as cynical as we are. And I think that's a constant reminder, not just to other people, but like to myself.
Absolutely, I love that. Lydia Liza is again on Nuclear Whales, as well as is there two others?
The end of their world as they know it.
Absolutely, and we'll be with you at the Hook and Ladder on Saturday, the 30th of November. Let's foreground her vocals in Nuclear Whales as well, and there's like a soundbite here. People can hear Lydia. I love Lydia's vocals. Will she be playing at a set? Will she be joining you, but also performing separately?
Yeah, we decided to keep our event on the 30th pretty in-house. It's just the people who are on the album. So Lydia will be kind of the opening act doing a set, and then will also join us for those two songs. And then this hasn't been announced, but it's still up in the air. We're gonna try to get B. Ferguson there to share a poem or two as well.
Oh wow!
So it'll just be the people who worked on the album.
Very nice. Yeah. And Big Cats.
Yeah, as the DJ and who produced all the music on the album.
They crossed the line in the sand so many times, they finally arrived at the coastline. Now staring at the waves, waiting for a sign. Let's give them a sign. That's Lydia's vocals on Nuclear Whale.
Yeah.
And that call for "let's give them a sign," I think relates interestingly to a lot of what we've been saying today. Another favorite lyric of mine, like a single burning bush is a sign, but not a million. And that's my single favorite lyric actually on the record. Do you have, to close, any final thoughts on this that call to, or like let's give them a sign, like the address? Let us give them a sign, I think, is significant. And also that song ends with what we discover and bring back from the future, all that's inside is this line has been redacted. That's an interesting formal feature too. Any final thoughts on those components?
Yeah, I think those lines really point back to something we've been talking about through this conversation, of the idea of agency. And I think the role of, I don't want to get too grandiose, but the role of art in movement work, I think, is a Venn diagram of many different bubbles. But two of those bubbles are, one is on a very concrete, down-to-earth material level, how do we use our access to audiences to point people in the direction of other people who are like doing the work, right? So like if someone finds the album and they like it, and then they see that, on the web post, like I'm posting about other things that are happening, specific organizing work that is happening, ways people can plug into movement work, like that's really important. If we can, continue to use the platforms we have to raise money and point people in the direction of this work, that's really good. And then I think the other one other bubble in that Venn diagram is the kind of, again, not to quote myself, but on the last album there's a line that says, the smallest act of resistance when the emperor is naked is just to say it and say it and say it, and like to be out there telling the truth, right? And like saying the thing that is important to us, whether that is super metaphorical and poetic or super straightforward. I think there's room for both.
Yeah.
And to, by virtue of saying the thing, open up more space for more people to say their things too. Like that's a running thread through all the work that I've done, both as an artist, but then also as like a youth worker and someone who helps organize spaces for other people to speak. Like,
I am excited for the release show. and to witness you and Big Cats in action.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It has been a long time. But so, so how did you end up collaborating with Spencer Big Cats again at this particular time with this particular project?
Yeah, it kind of came together through happenstance, and I was not, I keep saying day job, but like I'm a poet, so I travel to colleges and conferences, and I perform usually a cappella poetry that then becomes jumping off point for facilitated dialogue around different issues. I do a lot of work around like masculinity and consent, and like that's kind of like the main artistic thing that I do. And then I've always also been a rapper, for 20 years. I've worked with different producers and put out music and stuff. But, in 2023, 2024, like as many local musicians I'm sure you talk to might relate to, like it's just hard to release music. It's a ton of work, sometimes a ton of investment on like a money side for very little, like, no one's gonna go get super famous. No one's gonna sell 1 million records anymore, and like that's okay. And so I wasn't planning to release another album. I was like, I'm gonna focus on the poetry stuff that I'm doing. It's good work, it's important, I like it. And then Spencer Big Cats got in touch with me about a project he was thinking about of releasing like little mini projects with different vocalists, and like let's just do 2 songs and it'll be part of that thing. And like that other thing ended up not happening, but the 2 songs that I wrote I think were Roguelike and Nuke the Whales. And they're like, well, because these have so many similarities already, that could be the seed of maybe a concept album. And like had already been thinking about, like, I want to write more about climate, and this could be an opportunity to do that. And so from there, the songs really flowed out really naturally. And it felt really good, again, because so much of music, you really have to do it for yourself. And it was, I think, a very healthy way to process my own thoughts about everything that's been happening over the last decade and put them in an album. And so, yeah, we just decided to keep moving. I've been performing live for the past 5-6 years, like constantly, but again, usually poetry stuff.
Yeah.
There was the Fred Again thing, which I don't know if you know about that, but like the little guest appearance I had with him. So I've been so connected to music stuff. But this has been an adventure to try to organize a show, promote the show, get people to hear the album using, or like trying to adapt techniques that I picked up over 15 years about promotion and outreach, and knowing that you really have to be more creative these days.
Will you play other shows with Big Cats now that you have this new collection of songs? Or for the time being, at least, is this the one performance?
Yeah, I think in terms of like organizing a show, this is all we're planning to do. But we're, if there's a festival or another show that wants, us to come in as an opening act or something, like we're definitely open to that, because that's the other thing, like performing live on a music level is just fun, right? And like more opportunities to do it, like let's keep doing it. And I think in this historical moment, the more spaces that we can cultivate to bring people together, to experience art and just like be together, that's important to be able to cultivate that kind of community.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I can hopefully there'll be other opportunities for me to witness you and Spencer, perhaps Lydia, coming together again. Still, at the same time, though, this is the first time in a long time that Big Cats and Guante there's been an opportunity to witness the live experience. I've loved it in the past and looking forward to it again. And I strongly encourage everyone who is remotely interested to come to the Hook and Ladder on Saturday, 30th of November for the record release.
Just as a parting thought, I think sometimes, maybe this is my own insecurity, but I think about when I talk about my work, that it communicates as like music as homework. Like, oh, this album's really smart and really about like activism and stuff, and it feels like homework. But like, we've been rehearsing, and like, this is a fun album.
Yeah,
I think it's funny, and like you can move to it. So we're really excited to share it with people.
You are such a good performer too. You always engage the crowd very well. So I am hoping to be able to be part of that engaged crowd.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me today, Guante. We'll see you at the Hook and Ladder on Saturday, November 30th. And please come back to the city again next time you have anything poetry or more music that you'd like to discuss.
Thank you.
It's what kind of end will we make it?